Aloha, my name is Julie Mitchell, and I am the Executive Director here at Ikahi Mediation Center. To let you know a little bit about us, we are one of 5 nonprofit community mediation centers in the state, and I see some representatives from other of our mediation centers throughout the islands. Welcome. We were founded back in 1983 as a program of the Island of Hawaii YMCA, and in 2006 we became our own independent nonprofit. That means we are 39 years old this year. Our mission is to empower people to come together, to talk and to listen, to explore options and to find their own best solutions. To achieve this mission, we offer mediation, facilitations, and training like this one, to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. This Brown Bag Lunch series is held every 3rd Thursday at 12 noon on Zoom, and you have to register on Eventbrite each time to receive the Zoom link. I want to tell you about another exciting series of trainings that we have going on right now with Sylvia Dolina, who has worked a lot with large companies like Hewlett-Packard and Best Buy as a program manager and consultant. And she is doing, I believe, the 3rd in her series of 8 trainings with us. They are completely free. The next one is called Boundless Collaboration, Conversation plus Contribution plus Teamwork equals Innovation. These are in person at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, so you do need to be located in Hilo or willing to come over here to attend. And I'm going to put a description of that course and a link to register in the Zoom chat if you would like to find out more about that. We welcome your attendance. And that is thanks to a grant from the Atherton Family Foundation for the most part, as well as the United Way, Hawaii Island United Way, and the County of Hawaii, also sponsors of this series. At the end of our talk today, we will ask you to fill out a short online survey, which helps continue our grant funding for this free series. And when I put the survey link in the chat, just take a minute to click into that and give us your thoughts. I will also email within the next day or so a link to the video for today's talk, along with a handout from Fred and another link to that Zoom, online survey. If you like today's talk, please register for more in the future. Coming up October 20th is Dawn Chang, who resides on Oahu. She will be presenting on the topic Preventing and Resolving Community Conflicts by Designing a Culturally Sensitive Engagement Process. And I'll also put that description and the link to sign up for that talk into our chat. Without further ado, let me introduce our topic and speaker for today. Our topic is morality, justice, and conflict. What do people need to accept a resolution? And our presenter, Fred Jandt, is currently residing in California, and I found him because somehow I started following him on LinkedIn. He does a weekly blog that I really enjoy reading, and I look forward to them weekly. And so I started liking them, and I reached out to him via LinkedIn and asked him about being a participant in our series, and he said yes. He is a professor emeritus and retired college dean. Fred has authored several books, including Win-Win Negotiating, Turning Conflict into Agreement, and Constructive Conflict Management, Asia-Pacific Cases. Fred previously conducted the training Managing Conflict Productively for major corporations and government agencies throughout the United States. A mediator, he has trained hundreds of prospective mediators for court and community settings. In our best Zoom fashion, let's please offer Fred a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Let me tell you, there's nothing I enjoy more than speaking with mediators, and particularly right now, because I'm just coming out of a 6-hour meeting I'm a trustee of a community college district, and it was 6 hours of just torture. So I'm so happy to be here because this is with a group of people I enjoy being with. Thank you so much for inviting me. Let me tell you a little bit about how I got into mediation. I first experienced it at Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations. I had some informal associations with FMCS mediators. And I taught communication and dispute resolution for many years. Then did research on mediation, particularly with Paul Peterson, a clinical psychologist. And we did a major project with the Asia Foundation on the use of mediation in Asia Pacific countries. And now I do mediation and I train volunteer mediators particularly for small claims and community programs. So that's my background. That's where I'm coming from. Today's topic in general is understanding how people view conflict. And let me explain what that means, because sometimes when we're working with people, we focus on their conflict, their issues and their problems. But today's topic is understanding how they think about conflict. And if we can better understand how they think about conflict, we can better help them come to resolutions. That's our general topic for today. So let me give you an example. We're talking about consistency of behavior. So all of us may tend to do something repeatedly, consistently. That doesn't mean that we'll do that every time, but there's a consistency there. So here's an example. You're in a busy grocery store. You pick up the cart. You start your shopping and you look down in the cart and you see an envelope. And you just take a quick look at the envelope and you see two $20 bills. What are you going to do? You have to make a decision about that $40. You're busy. You have to go to your next appointment. What are you going to do? So I'm not going to ask you what you're going to do. I want you to think about what you would do, because the major point of this discussion today is what you do with that $40 could help us predict how you would handle other situations. Got it? So that helps us, if we understand how people react in one situation, there's a consistency that's going to occur in other situations. So understanding that consistency is what the topic about today. So what we're doing, our objective is to better understand those consistencies that help us better understand and help people to get what they need in a mediation. And much of today is based on research done by Steve Littlejohn. And today there's no PowerPoint. We're just going to talk. There'll be time for questions later, and I use a lot of case studies in our discussion. But a word on confidentiality and case studies. All my case studies are real, but as you know from ethical statements for mediators, we can use real case studies in training, but they're all disguised, so they can't be identified to any real people. So we adhere to confidentiality, even though they're real case studies. So let's begin. We're going to talk about 3 dimensions of consistency. And let's start with moral reality. And I'll identify the others later because we can get all wrapped up in the terminology, but let's do one at a time. Moral reality refers to the deeply held beliefs about proper conduct. In other words, if I were to ask you, what should you do about that $40 in the shopping cart? How you answer that question tells us a little bit about your moral reality. So the terms that are identified to describe possible categories are, first of all, authoritarian. I don't like that word, but that was the one that was chosen. It means that our decision about what is proper conduct is based on some ultimate authority. Doesn't matter what it is, but we decide what is appropriate based on that ultimate authority. The second, again, I don't like this term, but it's Republican, and here it means we decide what we should do based on civic duty or public service, or in a sense, what is the right thing to do in our community. Third is utilitarian. That is fulfilling individual needs through negotiation, that we should get what we want in proper negotiation with the people around us. And fourth, expressivist. Free expression, pursuit of individual rights, the other people don't matter. All right, so these four. Authoritarian, we decide what to do based on some ultimate authority. Republican, we decide what to do based on civic duty, law, public service. Utilitarian, we negotiate situational, what's right. Or expressivist, we do what's right for us. Okay, so you might think about what would you do with that $40 in a grocery cart, all right? Let me give an example. Many years ago, Forrest Mostyn, Woody Mostyn, started, I don't know if you know, but he started a negotiation service called Mostyn Mediation. I don't know if you know, but Forrest Mostyn was one of the 3 founders of Jacoby and Myers, but he broke off and established himself at Mostyn Mediation because he was much more wanting to do mediation than what Jacoby and Myers wanted to do. But he started a national mediation service, and I did a few for him when he started. And the first one he asked me to do was for a young couple without children who were separating, and they simply wanted a mediation to decide how to divide their belongings. I typically don't do family mediation, but I said I'd do it for him. And it thought that it would be fairly easy because the woman asked for mediation because her aunt from Florida was a mediator and encouraged her to use mediation to work with her husband to try to divide their assets. And it was really their assets and their debts. It really was more debts than assets, but that's what I thought the mediation was going to be. Well, rarely is it as simple as what it starts out to be. Yes, they wanted to divide their assets and their debts, but the husband had some strong things to say about their life together. It appeared that the young woman was very talented and skilled and had a very successful position and was moving up in her organization and had every possibility of moving up even higher. He was a skilled laborer who was, little chance of doing more than that. And so they were kind of in different life trajectories. And the second thing that he wanted to talk about in mediation was that he felt that she had been unfaithful, and he wanted to make that very well known because in his belief system that the marriage should be completely faithful to one another, and any deviation from that was a moral wrong. He even wanted to make that known to her because he accused her of causing him to have a sexual transmitted disease. So this is where the mediation went to. So let me talk about their moral reality for a minute. He had a traditional authoritarian moral vision. In his way of looking at the world and looking at this conflict, there was an ultimate authority as what was right and what was wrong, and her being unfaithful was wrong, period. That was the moral reality. Her moral reality, she was highly expressivist. In other words, free pursuit of individual rights. She saw herself as highly mobile, highly successful, and was looking at her best interest. So you can see how each one was highly frustrated by the other. You can see how dividing property and debts could be a little complicated, and it should be simple. You see how the moral reality entered in on this? His whole perspective on how we divide things was there is a right way, and that's how we should do this. Her perspective is, I want to divide this in such a way so that I can get on with my life. And understanding that moral reality helped me as the mediator, help them work together. We did get things divided. The most difficult thing to divide was actually the 3 dogs. And that does happen, but we were able to reach an agreement, but it did help to understand, where they were each coming from. And at one point, I had to ask him in a caucus, do you want this relationship to continue? And he thought about that very carefully, and he said, no. Because she has violated the way things should be. And when he was able to verbalize that, it was possible to move things along. Okay. But understanding, do you see where how each of them saw what was right and wrong and the proper way to do things really affected how they divided up property. Okay. All right. Hope that makes sense. The second way of looking at this is how conflicts in general are understood and how they should be managed. So we can sort of look at conflict reality, if you will, how it should be managed. For example, should our conflicts go to outside parties, courts, arbitration, community elder? Should we manage conflict by ourselves? And how should we manage it if we do it by ourselves? Do we see conflict as unavoidable, but potentially healthy and functional? Do we look at conflict as economic bargaining? Do we look at conflict in terms of power and struggle over power? Do we look at majority rule? Or do we look at ways to find consensus? In other words, how should conflicts be managed? Outside parties, should we manage it ourselves? Or should we avoid conflict? Should conflict be avoided because it's destructive and harmful? Or in a libertarian perspective, conflicts are differences, and what we want to do is minimize contact and minimize interaction. So remember, this second area is how should conflicts be handled? Got it? Okay, so let's go back to our separated couple. Remember the husband and the wife? How he wanted the conflict handled was an outside authority figure to divide things. That he saw the proper way to divide things was with an outside authority figure to do the division. Okay. She was most comfortable, I think you can guess from her perspective, to negotiate who got what. She wanted to negotiate. So this was kind of hard to get them to work together, you see, because they had really different ideas about how the conflict should be managed. So I had to spend some time with them to have them talk about, well, how are we going to solve this? Should we make a list of everything and let another party make the division, or should we negotiate? So before we actually worked on it, we decided how are we going to work on it. Does that make sense? And it was much more productive when they were able to decide how we're going to work on it, because they had different ideas about the proper way to deal with the conflict. Got it? Okay, so let me give you another example. This is environmental conflict. Environmental conflicts are too frequent and so difficult, but here in Southern California, the Coachella Valley is, the resort area of Southern California. And it used to be desert before it became Hollywood's hideaway. When it was a desert, it was home for many desert plants and desert animals, including bighorn sheep and something called the fringe-toed lizard. Okay. Now, the fringe-toed lizard is it's sort of unusual because it has to live in sand, because it runs along the top of the sand and then dives into the sand. So it has to live in areas where the sand is loose or soft. So at one time, there was over 100 square miles of this kind of sand. But as the population of the Coachella Valley increased, there was more and more encroachment on the land that was used by the fringe-toed lizard. So there's the environmental conflict. So many years ago, there was, at one time, well, up in, let's see, there's something like 220 golf courses in the Coachella Valley, something like that. At one time, a group called the Sunrise Development Company proposed building another country club. And they purchased, or wanted to purchase, 400 acres of land, which had the fringe-toed lizard. And they proposed changing this desert soft sand into golf courses. And of course, the fringe-toed lizard can't live on golf courses. The developers of this property were some of the most wealthy and politically well-known economic elite in Southern California. So here we have developers with great political and economic power. And then we have groups that were attempting to protect the fringe-toed lizard. We had the Ecological Reserve Foundation, Nature Conservatory, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife on one side, and the developers on the other side. So if we want to talk about the issues first, the issues was very clear. One was the preservation of an endangered species. And the other side was property rights. When you buy property, do you have the right to use it as you want? Or, in fact, if they were forced to deal with the fringe-toed lizard, was that not in fact the government taking their land? So it was property rights versus the environmental rights of the fringe-toed lizard. Fringe-toed lizard. Unfortunately, the fringe-toed lizard is not a particularly attractive animal. It's not the panda bear. You have to like lizards to like the fringe-toed lizard. So the developers demanded property that they owned. The environmentalists demanded property be set aside for a protected habitat. It was that simple. So now let's go back and use this logic here. The developers had a utilitarian moral reality. They wanted to negotiate, but their perspective on conflict management was to use power, but rather than lose, they would revert to an economic model to negotiate a compromise. So their model for dealing with the conflict was exert power, and they had it. They were wealthy, prominent individuals. If they didn't get what they want, they would be willing to negotiate some kind of arrangement. The environmentalists were coming from a totally different perspective. They had a Republican moral reality, belief that there should be adherence to law, civic order, and they believed that civic duty with civic duty, the government should deal with the conflict in a way that would build consensus. You got See how these people were so different in how they looked at conflict? The developers, let's get what we want, and if we can't get it immediately, let's negotiate. The environmentalists, well, there is a civic duty, responsibility to human and animal life, but we can use and work toward consensus so that we can all live together. See how different those approaches are? Okay. So something happened that's kind of affected the outcome here. And I, in later years, tried to verify how this happened. But the environmentalists agreed that the attorney for the developers would act as a mediator. Why did the environmentalists agree to that? Well, think about where they're coming from. Civic duty, build consensus. I think it was from their real belief that the attorney, even though he was working for the developers, had a feeling for civic duty and law and would do the right thing to build consensus. I asked one of the developers who I know, I asked him, why did they agree to that? And his response, he was very guarded, but he said they understood who he was. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, they understood who he worked for. So strange. But anyway, they did reach an agreement. The resolution was to protect 7,000 acres of land, which is only about 10% of the undeveloped land at that time. And to set up an arrangement where the developers would have to pay $100 an acre to build a fund to buy additional land for the French-toed lizard. Now, $100 an acre when this happened may have been a minor tax, but that same land today in some parts of this sells for $500,000 to $750,000 an acre. So how much are you going to buy out of that fund? You know, so the fringe-toed lizard didn't come out too well in that negotiation. But I want you to think about how they were each approaching that conflict from such different perspectives. Okay. Sometimes I think, I think there's a question, huh? Is that a question? No. Okay. Then the third area is justice reality. And that is, how do people believe the appropriate final outcome or the consequences of the conflict should happen? So some examples are retributive justice, punish the wrongdoer; competitive justice, which is maximize gain and minimizes losses, like through competition or averaging; or distributive justice, which is more on fairness or equity or social welfare or entitlement. So what is the appropriate way to develop the outcome? Okay, back to my husband and wife. Remember the choices: retributive justice, punish the wrongdoer; competitive justice, maximize gains, minimize losses through negotiation; distributive justice, fairness or equality. Okay, my husband and wife. I think you might be able to guess. The husband, remember, authoritarian moral reality, wanted someone from the outside to decide in terms of what would be the better way, better outcome. He wanted retribution. He wanted her punished because she had violated what he thought was their bond to one another. He wanted retribution. She wanted to work out an agreement based on competitive bargaining. You know, that was it. She wanted to reach an equitable, fair, negotiated agreement, period. You see how far apart they were and how to get there? So how could we get him to feel okay with his need for retribution? And this was the simplest thing, but it made him feel okay. Remember I said they had a lot of debts? He wanted copies of all of the credit card statements. He wanted to see where she had been spending money. And in his mind, in some way, that dealt with his need for retribution, that he would now know that he knew where she had been spending money. That made him feel okay. Without that little thing, I don't think we could have reached an agreement because he wanted retribution. Does that make sense? All right, let's go to the French-toed lizard. Okay. Remember, the developers had utilitarian moral reality to use negotiation and to use power rather than lose. So they would revert to negotiation for their justice reality to minimize losses and to maximize gain. You know, whatever necessary to maximize gain, minimize losses. That was what they wanted, how this would end. The environmentalist held a Republican moral reality, convinced that civic duty should govern, that justice reality should be distributive and a fairness, and that was their standard to reach an agreement, fairness. And maybe that's why they agreed that the attorney for the developers would be their mediator, because they were really honestly believed that consensus was possible. But people who seek consensus with a group that's out to negotiate power and get what they want, see how that may have come out the way actually it did. Now, the researchers raised an interesting question, which I'd like to share with you now. And their question has to do with us as mediators. Because each one of us has these same standards ourselves. We have our own moral reality, our own conflict reality, and our own justice reality. How would our views cause us to act as mediators? So there's a real question for future discussions, and that is, do we allow people to resolve issues the way they choose, the manner that they choose, even though we may think there's a better manner to get there? So do we as mediators impose our values on the process? Now here's another question. How do we identify what people's moral reality, conflict reality, and justice reality is? Well, you know, just like the shopping cart, listen to how people tell you they resolved conflicts in the past. You know, because that consistency is important here. Let them tell you how they feel something was successfully resolved in the past. And that tells you about something about what they are looking for in this conflict. So I've sometimes asked disputants when we might be having problems, I might say, well, you know, was there ever a situation like this that you dealt with before, and how was that resolved? And can you tell me about that? And then people can tell you about a past conflict. And as they're talking about that past conflict, you can see and you can help them see what they think is the way it should be handled. Okay. Another way is to listen to the language and clues that they give you in their language. And I, of course, am borrowing here a great deal from narrative mediation. And this is, John Winsley, narrative mediation does so well, and I'm only borrowing a small part of what he does here. And there's a small claims case over a fallen tree that caused damage to a fence that was between two neighbors. And you listen to how the neighbors described the conflict. Okay, one talked about it as a war, that his neighbor attacked him in a confrontation and dropped a bomb when he filed the small claims court. All right, just the language that he used to describe the conflict tells you a lot about how he thinks about how conflict should be resolved. The more he talked about it, it was clear that the conflict reality was power. The justice reality was retribution. He wanted to punish his neighbor. And his moral reality was authoritarian. But how he was looking at that conflict was from that perspective. And, you know, interestingly enough, in that one example, it was a very long mediation, even though it was a small amount of damage. It was not successful because he wanted his day in court. He wanted the authority to tell them how it should come out. And he lost, but you know, that's what he wanted. Okay. So again, let me go back to mediators and peacemakers. We have our own moral reality. We have our own justice reality. We have our own conflict reality. And there's somewhat of an ethical question here as a mediator or peacemaker as we approach conflict. Is it simply being a mediator to advance one approach, or should we be open to how people themselves want to resolve the conflict and work with them in their own realities? Okay. So let me talk about one final case, and then we have time for some questions. I had a case of two people, Christopher and Sarah. Christopher and Sarah were members of the same small church. They were friends. And they decided as friends to buy two small houses together and renovate the two small houses. And they were in the same church, they were friends, they were in that same friendship network, and everything looked like this should be a wonderful deal for both of them, because Sarah and her children could live in one house, and Christopher could live in the other house, and they could work on the properties together and renovate them and sell them to both their benefits. Looked like a great plan. Well, as it developed, Sarah began to one day open the mail and find past due notices from the mortgage company. She confronts Christopher as to why are they behind in payments to the mortgage company. And there's a physical fight. Christopher hits the refrigerator. Sarah gets frightened, orders him out of the house. And it's even more complicated because they both work for the same company. And Sarah's job at the company was to dispatch her, to send people out on jobs. And Christopher was one of the people that she sent out on jobs. So their relationship at the work site was strained because she was, Christopher's mind, giving her a very hard time at work. So now we had complaints about harassment at jobs, the money, and what are we going to do about the houses, the physical threat. So they did not go to community mediation. They went to mediation in their church. And what I am told, I was not there, but from what I'm told, what happened was they learned a lot about Christopher. Christopher was the son of the minister. And the mediators at the church were looking at him as someone who should reflect the values of the church, but that was not the case. But they were trying to make him a better person. but his moral reality was clearly expressivist. He wanted to do what was best for him and what felt good. In terms of conflict reality, he wanted to avoid conflict whenever he could because it was unpleasant. And his way of dealing with conflict was just to avoid it, not to deal with it. So Sarah, on the other hand, she was authoritarian. Authoritarian was Republican. She wanted this dealt with in a legal way. She wanted it done through bargaining and negotiation. But if that didn't work, she wanted to go to the court. So do you see how we got really two different ways of looking at the world here that were very much in conflict? He wanted to avoid conflict, do what he wanted to do that felt good for him, and avoiding conflict. That's what he wanted to do. She, on the other hand, felt that, look, he had violated law. We should follow the law to deal with this, and he should be punished if he'd done wrong. Boy, they were far apart in terms of this, as you can imagine. They were really way far apart from each other. And it was complicated by the fact that he was, of course, the manager's son, and the mediators in the church really were trying to pressure him to do right. But now understanding the expressivist person who wants to avoid conflict and do what he wants to do, this is something to watch out for in any mediation. Will frequently agree to anything to get it over with, to avoid the conflict. So you can guess what happened here? They mediated with the church. Christopher agreed that he would do the right thing. And guess what happened a couple months later? Right? He did the same thing he did before. She discovered he was using money in their joint account for personal items. Okay. The expressivist does what feels right. Okay. And poor Sarah saw the legal way to handle this. So they have continued problems. Okay. Okay, I went really fast, but I left time for questions. So I hope there are some questions because I can give you more examples as we talk. So does anyone want to share an example or ask a question?
If you do, you can use the reactions to raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself and start talking, and hopefully we will hear you.
Or I can ask you questions if you
Okay, I see Diane has unmuted herself, Fred.
Okay.
I understand how making an assessment of the folks you have in front of you early on, before you try to start working with them on the specifics, makes a lot of sense. You gave a couple of examples of how to do that. You said, well, have you had a similar situation or some kind of conflict in the past that resolved the way you appreciated that it resolved? Can you give us more examples of some of the ways you suss out who you've got in front of you?
Okay. Well, obviously you don't want to make assumptions, stereotype assumptions. Obviously you're going to be wrong, okay? Or you can be very wrong. So my fallback is, I tell you what one thing as a mediator that I fall back on so often when things are difficult is, of course, silence. And that is, I will just stop the mediation. And I've done this too, and another co-mediator is so much better at it than I am. I'll tell you the way she does it. And I've seen her do this so effectively. she will just stop and just fold her hands and look at the other party, look at the party and say, I don't think I'm doing the best I can for you people. I just don't know what to do right now. What do you think we should do? And you know, of course, that is acting, but she's just asking, what do you want to do? Which is the question I sometimes ask people. And I'm always amazed that when I ask that question, sometimes the blank expression I get on people's face, that they've been in conflict for a great while, and here we are in mediation, and I will say, what is that you want to accomplish? And there's suddenly this, I don't know, I can't answer, because they haven't figured out how to answer that question yet. So a question like, well, what do you think we should do? And how do you think we should do it? Just a question like that gets to that really directly sometimes. And sometimes people have said, what do you think we should do? What would you like to see done? Sometimes someone will say, well, if they would just own up to this situation. You see what that tells you? Right there. And that has given you so much information about why they perhaps are talking and acting the way they do, is because they want that person to take responsibility. And that's what they're looking for. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And that one is so good, works so well. It's a simple question, you know, and you know, I do it with such real honesty and real simplicity. Like, what is it that you want to accomplish here? You know, and that can tell you so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes I think one of the best things we can do as mediators is display our ignorance. Can people relate to that? And sometimes new mediators, I think, can make the mistake of doing too much. Does that make sense? Okay. I hope you can understand that reaction. Okay. Another person have a comment or question? Comments are welcome.
Helena? Just unmute.
There we go. Hi, Fred.
Hi.
Thank you for this. I just recently, in a business setting, kind of was a very informal mediator conflict between a client and another business person. And my question is, I feel like now that I can put some names to this, I feel like I was observing one of them that was better at it than the other and took advantage. And so the one that was better at it was the competitive, sort of like, you know, was calling it a negotiation when it really wasn't, was really, you know, really not in the right, but he knew that the other party was very authoritarian, very right and wrong, very sort of, and called him out on something that he'd overheard him say or do that embarrassed him, made, you know, he apologized, you know, that wasn't my intention, I'm so sorry. And actually put him into a weakened position and got him to do things that I thought he shouldn't offer. So as a mediator, what do you do when you sort of see one taking advantage of another?
Wow, that's a great example, isn't it? That's a great example. That gets, you know, as a mediator, we deal with two areas, not only fairness of outcome, but fairness of process. You know, and you know, there's a lot of debate as mediators, should we be more concerned with one or the other, which is more important, fairness of outcome or fairness of process? And what you've identified is one that actually goes with both, doesn't it? It's fairness of outcome and fairness of process. How you would deal with that, how I would deal with that Boy, that's a tough one. What did you do? Before, give me some time to think too. What did you do?
I felt that I didn't want to, because I'm not mediator. I was just sort of there as a
Right.
trying to be
Informal.
unbiased. So I wasn't really sure what to do, and I felt that they were unraveling the process the way that they were going to when I saw somebody have an upper hand and take advantage of it, and I didn't feel like there was a whole lot I could do. He offered up something I thought that he didn't need to. And at that point, to say that, I didn't know how that would be perceived. So unfortunately, I felt that the one that was a little bit more savvy won.
Yeah. One thing that's difficult, it wasn't a formal mediation. You were not actually acting as a mediator, right? Right. You were just observing their interaction, right? Okay. Yeah, just observing their interaction, it's probably, you were correct in observing. That was about it, right? If that had occurred in a mediation, you would have to deal with the concept of fairness. And was that fair and equitable? And always, as a mediator, when there is a power discrepancy, a real power discrepancy that affects the outcome, the mediator does need to, in some way, ensure that the low power person is comfortable with what's going on, which is why, some mediators will not do any mediation where there's an obvious power discrepancy, like between a manager and an employee. Other mediation, particularly like in the big post office redress program, so many of those deal with that discrepancy of power, but they use the narrative approach to try to deal with the relationship issue. So I think in the situation you described, if you were the actual mediator, if you could get them to agree to sort of use the narrative approach and talk about the dynamics of that relationship, that would be the approach if that were a formal mediation session. Do you know the mediation, the redress mediation program?
No, I'm thinking this actually might go in the direction of mediation, so it's very timely.
The redress program, the largest mediation program in the country. It's mediation at the Postal Service, and it was it's called Project Redress. And historically it came about with a large number of EEO complaints filed in the post office. And they developed a form of mediation which is based on the narrative approach, where the focus is not on solving the problem, but on talking about clarifying the communication between the parties in the relationship. So it's a big mediation program by the post office called Project Redress. And a lot of the mediators that I've trained have gone on to do that program. So the strength of that program is to encourage people in formal mediation in a setting where they talk about the dynamics of their relationship. Okay. That was a roundabout answer, but I hope that was useful to some people. We've got just about a few more minutes before Julie will stop us, but I'm happy for another question.
I put the link to the redress mediation program that I just found. I'd never heard of it before in the
really?
in the
Okay.
chat. So if you want to link into that, and I see Kenny G and Maribel both have questions, and I've also put the link to our survey in the chat, which I hope folks will take before they leave today. So let's go with Kenny and then Maribel.
I'm happy to go as long as you're willing to let me go. So.
Thank you. I was just kind of curious, because to me, the essence of mediation is our neutrality.
Yes.
And so I question how we maintain our neutrality in these kind of circumstances. That, to me, you always have to toss it back to the people and let them work it out. And whether or not, how much of our personal beliefs are we supposed to impose on what we may not think is an equitable resolution, but the parties both agree to.
You have identified one of the major ethical questions in mediation. And it particularly comes up in situations of power imbalance. And I personally did was doing a small claims court mediation one day, and it was a gentleman who was suing his former employer. His former employer had sold him a used vehicle and was taking money out of each of his paychecks. And then he fired the man and took the truck back. So the man sued him in small claims court for his salary that had been deducted. And when we sat down in mediation, the business owner turned to me first and he said, look, I want you to understand he's not a citizen, so he's got no standing in court. Okay, now, had I been neutral, completely neutral, I wouldn't have said anything. But what I said was, in small claims court, you don't need to be a citizen to sue. So did I violate neutrality in telling him that? You don't think so?
No, not at all.
Not at all? Well, some people would think that I did violate neutrality.
No, that's reality, not neutrality.
Yeah. But had I not said that, he would have, discouraged that gentleman from believing that he had any rights at all. So that, that's the ethical question.
That's reality checking.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with you on that one. Okay. But you've identified one of the major ethical questions in mediation. Okay, I want to get some more questions, but
Thank you.
thank you for that. Yes.
Okay, let's go with Maribel and then Ben. And I'm aware that it is 1. So for those of you who need to leave, go ahead and go off to whatever you need to do. We thank everyone for coming today. Please do take a few minutes to fill out our short online survey, which helps with our grant funding for this free series. I've put the survey link a couple times in the chat. And I will be emailing you within the next couple days a handout prepared by Fred. I'll send a link to his blog, and also I'll give you a link to this video. So if you do need to leave, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you next month with Don Chang on the topic Preventing and Resolving Community Conflicts by Designing a Culturally Sensitive Engagement Process. I'll put again the link to register for that in the chat, and we will keep going with, I see we've got 3 more questions now. Okay, I can tell we're going to go over. So if you want to stay, please do. And if you need to go ahead and move on with your life. So we'll go Maribel, then Ben, then Grayson.
And before we start, for those of you that leave, thank you so much for being here. And I'm sorry if I was a bit didactic and rushed, but someone who works with mediators, I just am so motivated to get all this stuff out and talk to folks that I can sometimes just go on too much. So I hope I gave you one good idea, and if I did that, it was success. So who are we responding to?
Maribel.
Maribel, thank you for putting this brown bags together. I really learned a lot, and I really appreciated that. I guess the way that the content was, presented to us is in forms of stories. That helps the content stick in my head, at least past this session. As far as my question goes, so let's say you have 2 parties that are just diametrically opposed, right? Somebody's authoritarian, another person is expressivist. They're here to, try to resolve a conflict. How do you, I guess, since they're so diametrically opposed, how do you kind of bring them together to resolve a conflict?
Again, sometimes we need to ask them to begin to focus on such questions as, how are we going to decide? So when you get them to talk more about the process and less about the conflict, that sometimes helps to deal with situations like that. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Ben?
Ben needs to unmute.
Yeah, both your presentation and also Kenny's question just kind of highlighted for me the importance of intake. When you get your information before the mediation even starts, from a center, it's pretty well done because you've got a specialist. But for people mediating outside of redress or outside of a community center, it's critical to get that pre-information as well, even though you'll have to verify some. And
Yes.
I'm thinking one of the things is
Good point.
like timing, because if your people are in different places, it may be one just hasn't, when you ask the question, are you ready for this marriage to be gone? A lot of times the answer is no. So the mediation can't happen then. It's got to happen later. But the other thing I was thinking with, particularly with Kenny's question is, we are in charge of the process. And as you
Yes.
said, we can engage people in that. But ensuring the equality is so difficult. But again, the process in your tools will allow you in most styles of mediation to do that. And I'm thinking just real briefly, years ago, we actually had a program where we'd mediate cases even when there had been domestic violence.
Really?
Where there's this very serious power indifference. But the program was put together with our local family peace center. And of course, you can imagine it took a heck of a lot of training, but it was very, I think it's long gone, but it was very successful for a while because it empowered people that had previously had no power. But again, it was very delicate. And those are the ones, as you guys have identified, that are particularly problematic. But the process itself can do, I think, as good a job of ensuring equality of outcome without us actually having to, I mean, we can subtly use questions to raise issues, but again, it's exerting your power for sure. But I agree, that's the bugaboo is, if something's going really off the deep end, what can you do?
I know of one program with domestic issues that it was an experiment, but it worked while it was on. In other words, they used video and remote access, and it was that it was felt that when the person would be intimidated by the physical presence of the other person, how would it work if they were separated and done only by video? And they found that was very successful because the separation by video helped to equalize the power. So I found that really interesting, that something like that actually made it more successful.
Kind of shuttle diplomacy, but even easier with Zoom.
Yeah.
Good.
And one part of that is when they realized that made such a difference, they blacked out the screens even, so the person was not intimidated by the physical image of the other party, and that was even more successful. So the intimidation of power, even the physical image, makes a difference. So you're right on with that. Did they discontinue that program?
I think the Family Peace Center funding deteriorated or something. This was quite some time ago, but I remember how unique it was that people around the country were saying, how does that work? It was pretty successful.
Yeah, well, we need more programs like that, but you're right that doing that is you need such care to do those. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Grayson has a comment.
Yeah, Fred, I just wanted to comment. Thank you very much. I found this information that you shared to be very helpful. as a mediator, I sometimes struggle with a lot of these issues. And my takeaway from what you shared was that basically it gives us mediators an opportunity to have a deeper explorative conversation with both parties
Yes.
about why they feel the way they feel.
Yes.
And it gives language for us, and it gives some guidance so that we can explore, I guess, what's
Yeah.
below the waterline of their iceberg, so to speak.
Yes.
And I think that can increase the odds of eventual resolution
Yes.
without being, without us overstepping our lines as mediators. And I think also it allows us to have sort of an empathetic, sort of reflective moment to say, hey, the other guy is feeling like this because blah, 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 and some of these motivations, because the law, because they're thinking about the law, and this is, or they're thinking about their civic, whatever. And that
Mhm.
exploration and helping the other party, helping the party you're talking to understand better what the other party is going through and why could in and of itself increase the chances for ultimately a resolution. And then, of course, possible common ground, right? I mean, the more you know what and why they're coming from and what and why they're coming from, there might be some common ground that gets exposed that might, as mediators, we might be able to latch on and help the parties latch on to find resolution. So bottom line, thank you. And I really appreciate it. And thanks for giving a little bit more language and help for my mediation. That's all.
Great, Grayson, the way you said it helped me think about another way to talk about it and another way to look at it. And thank you for suggesting this. Is, we sometimes say conflict is not always about what people talk about.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's too easy for a mediator to focus on the issues that are presented, when the issues that are presented are just symbols. And you said that so much better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mhm. Thank you, Grayson.
So it's 1:10. I'm thinking we might like to let Fred go unless anybody else has any comments or questions before we end. We went over today, which is wonderful because we had a rich and interesting discussion and additional questions. Is there anything else before we give Fred a warm round of Zoom applause? Anything else?
Okay, I hope to visit with you someday.
Yes, it would be great to see you here on the islands, and thanks so many of you for coming today, having great interactions and interesting questions, and we hope to see you next month. And check Fred out on his blog or subscribe to him on, I think he's got his LinkedIn or Facebook or whatnot.
Both of them, yeah.
He does short articles regularly. They're always thought-provoking, so I highly recommend them. Thank you, Fred.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.